Do I want to be here in the beginning, or maybe we should just go home and not put up with all this?
I feel like you're always reaching out and trying to learn this new culture, and people aren't reaching out to hand to help you out at all.
You just want to go home, and you don't want to learn anymore, and it's time to end everything.
Listening to them, you might feel that they were immature, that they couldn't cope with their emotions as adults. But going and submerging totally in another culture with no support system can be pretty unnerving, even for the toughest of the toughs.
When I first went into Ghana, it was a real honeymoon stage. I was overjoyed at all the changes, and everything was new and everything was great, and meeting all these wonderful people, and you know, a new climate, geography, and it was a big thrill to go into this culture.
So you have that energy to go, okay, well, this is fun. After a few weeks, I find I start to miss home. I start to miss knowing how to react to situations and knowing how to act and adapt.
The first problem I had was about maybe 2 weeks after I'd been there, maybe even a week. I got a letter from my best friend at home, and as soon as I hadn't been homesick, and as soon as I saw the letter, I just started bawling, and then I was laughing and bawling, and it was just really odd for me.
One of the things about culture shock that they outlined before we left was just the whole idea that you would get things in your head about hating the culture that you were living in. And when I heard that, I was like, no, I would never do that. I have a very open mind. And so I thought I got there and everything was fine. I was very excited to be there and loved the culture. But there were a couple of days when I just woke up and I hated everything I saw, and I couldn't really figure it out.
There are certain norms and there are certain values, and to keep that society going, these things are reinforced all the time, and so it's very important to that society. And you get into another society and you recognize that the way of doing things, the values, aren't the same, and that they may not be any better or any worse than what you've been brought up with, what you've been led to believe. And so all of a sudden, it's not that you're not a person with a cultural problem, but what's happening is you're starting to think about whether these values are really the only values. And then you start to have a little bit of a culture shock.
I was surprised because I'd done a fair amount of traveling in Europe. I have relatives in Germany whom I'd visited. You know, it's Western culture and civilization, right? There was culture shock, and I was surprised that there was culture shock.
Now, often when we're thinking about culture shock, we envision culture shock because we're going to an African country or an Asian country where everything's different. The language is different, the food is different, etc., etc. So sometimes what happens is people who are going to places that are not as different or that aren't perceived to be as different, they don't prepare themselves to the same extent.
I try and ease their fears by telling them that it's quite normal, that everyone who goes from one culture to another will experience it. And so they will experience culture shock. It's not a question of if, it's to what degree they will experience it. And I try and go through with them the U-curve on culture shock, the 5 stages of acculturation. And it's a kind of roadmap for them so that when they are overseas and they feel elated about arriving in the country, then they know they're at the first stage. If they become very lonely and they think that they've made a big mistake by going overseas, then they know they're in stage 2, and it goes all the way through like that. And so that they're aware of where they are in their experience and that they're not alone. Everyone else on an exchange program is going through acculturation.
How does one know that you're experiencing culture shock? After all, even in our familiar environment, we do have our bad days, days of just pulling the hair out of sheer frustration. What makes it different?
I noticed, wow, I like to go to bed at 8 p.m. now, every day. Why is that? And in retrospect, it was obvious. At the time, though, I would sleep a lot. Also, I'm a fairly social person, and yet I spend a lot of my time in my room reading or writing letters, but not interacting with my host family or other Germans.
I started to feel that people didn't understand me at all, and that's a dangerous point to be at in terms of an overseas or cross-cultural placement, because you can really go either way. You can withdraw into yourself and sort of shut yourself off in your room and not want to talk to anyone.
When you go abroad and you're starting to feel homesick, or you're lonely, or you're frustrated, or you're angry, or you start to be very compulsive or obsessed with certain things, we try and indicate that perhaps you are experiencing culture shock.
Another very common reaction is to get together with fellow travelers and complain about the culture of the host country and the habits of the inhabitants.
Cultural bashing in an expatriate community, I mean, it's universal. And I don't think you necessarily have to repress that, those feelings in you. I mean, obviously it's difficult. You're immersed in a different culture and you'll have complaints. And to be, you know, psychologically healthy, you have to voice those complaints and talk them out. But when you fail to see the positive aspects of, you know, a different culture, that's when I think you're actually hurting yourself.
Communication becomes critical at such a moment of emotional tiredness. A part of culture shock is loneliness, an inability to talk, to share. You wouldn't exactly be helping yourself by locking yourself in your room.
In an academic setting will facilitate your learning, minimize some of the stresses involved in academic study. What else would I suggest? Be honest. Don't be scared to share your emotions. Once you've made some friends, or say you've got other friends who are exchange students or whatever, you know, be straight. Don't go to your room and cry.
There will be problems, but always remember to talk to people, communicate with them. It's absolutely critical that you talk with people and really get a feel, because they'll know better than you do what the story is and what's going on.
Having a journal abroad helps you understand what you are undergoing on a daily basis. Think of it as a safety valve for your feelings. Over a long period, it helps you to see how you've adapted to the host culture.
I wrote a lot in a journal, and it's great for me to have now, but at the time it was a good way to get out some feelings that I had, whether it was frustration at say a difficulty I'd had in the marketplace that day, or whether it was loneliness or whatever feeling I had. It was great to set it down in a diary, and then to reflect back on it a few days later helped me to get a good perspective on what was going on.
There's a difference between active and passive coping. Very often people will try to actively cope, in other words, change the problems that they are experiencing. But if you're a short-term visitor, very often this is not a sensible or practical thing to do. The society pre-existed your arrival, and it's going to probably remain much the same after you've gone. So perhaps passive coping is more successful. Rolling with the punches, so to speak, going with the flow, just accepting, knowing that these are the way things are done in the other culture, accepting them for what they are, and just learning to live with them for the time being, for the period of your sojourn.
I think you have to be more outgoing, perhaps, when you're abroad than you do at home. Things at home you take for granted, things like friendships tend to crop up, whereas when you're abroad and you're only there for a limited amount of time, you really have to make the effort.
Look on everything as being a new experience, and think of all the good things about what I was doing there, instead of think of the things that I was missing out on somewhere else.
I think that's part of maturing, is that you have to kind of push through the bad times. So I never really felt like, oh, I'm going to pack up and go home. But, you know, I would just feel depressed, and that's when my phone bill would go up, because I'd get on the phone and I'd call people and I'd talk and talk and talk and, you know, get the bill at the end of the month and regret it. But, I mean, I always felt a little bit better after that anyway, so it was, I guess, worth it.
It takes time, and I think you have to understand that it takes a lot of patience